Hi members. Okay, so this video lesson is going to walk you through how to tackle a question on the AQA paper. So it's extract based. Now, if you're with Excel, it's very similar in structure. OCR slightly different, so this wouldn't be relevant for OCR. But at Excel, EduCAS, AQA should be relevant to this. Okay, so now these are the assessment objectives for your English Lit, AO1, AO2, AO3, AO4. The only thing to point out here is that AO4 is not relevant to this question. It's relevant for the first question on this paper, which is your Shakespeare question. But AO1, AO2 and AO3, they're broken down 12, 12 and 6 of your 30 marks. Okay, so again, just to point out, do pause, there's a lot of information in this video, so do pause as and when necessary and jot down some notes. Okay, right, so what's the question look like? This is a sample question. The layout: read the following extract from stave 1, and then answer the question that follows. Here, Scrooge is being introduced to the reader for the first time. And then the question at the bottom, starting with this extract: how does Dickens present Scrooge as an outsider to society? So how do you approach it? You're sat there in May, you've got the exam paper in front of you, this is what you've turned over, this is the page, the extract that's coming up. What do you do? What's the first thing you do? Well, the first thing you do is you read this writing in bold, because it will give you the context for the extract within, and I've written play. Obviously, copy and pasted it from my Shakespeare one. Play for Shakespeare, novella for this one, obviously. Or if you're doing Jekyll and Hyde, you'll be answering that one. Okay. What's the next thing you do? So the second thing you do is to read the question, underlining or highlighting the keywords. In this case, Scrooge is an outsider. Okay, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on the question in a second. Okay, so Scrooge, so everything you answer has to reference or link to Scrooge as an outsider to society. Okay, so next thing you could do is to jot down what you know about the object of the question. So in this case, Scrooge. So here's some observations I've casually jotted down. He's obsessed by money. His job was a money counter or accountant as we know it today. He's portrayed in the opening pages as a mean, miserly, isolated individual. He is cruel, lacks compassion and lacks any warmth. He's no friends to speak of, is horrible to his only employee, Bob Cratchit, and is unpleasant to his only relative, his nephew, Fred. He is visited by the spirit of his old business partner, who reveals he regrets how he lived his life on earth, which was in a similar way to Scrooge, warning Scrooge that if he doesn't mend his ways, he will end up walking the earth in despair like Marley's ghost for all eternity. 3 further spirits visit him with the intention of encouraging him to change his miserly ways. They don't make him do anything. You know, Scrooge has an openness and willingness to change, to redeem himself. So, but they obviously help him along his way. It works, as by the end of the novella, Scrooge is the happiest, most generous benefactor the city has ever known. So there's the extract. Ignore my scribbles and scrawls, but this is how I've just sat down and in a couple of minutes read through it, highlighted the key areas and jotted down some notes, all in relation to Scrooge as an outsider. Okay, annotate as you read, so that when you come to writing it, you can see what points you can make and how you can link them together, because you can link from different parts of the extract. And I'll touch on how you structure your answer in a minute. Because this is just an example of how you could go about revising an exam question. Annotate the exam question in the exam as well, but maybe not to the extent I have here. Or you should be spending, say in AQA you've got 52 minutes for this question, unless you've got extra time. You need to be planning for 5 or 6 minutes, even a bit longer. And leave yourself 2 or 3 minutes at the end to reread what you've written. Okay, so with the question specifically in mind of Scrooge as an outsider, you could jot down a few initial observations, such as this extract is full of negative descriptors. He not only behaves in a bad way, he's utterly miserable himself. Repetition of no reinforces the negative portrayal. The use of Gothic imagery like evil and dark sets him out as different. He has no friends, isolated. Is mean and horrible to everyone, without any Christmas cheer. Dickens holds him up in stark contrast to everybody else's Christmas cheer. Rejects requests for charity, instead claiming that being poor is a crime and there are plenty of jails and workhouses for the poor people if they don't like the streets. Compared to all decent characters in the novella, he stands out as different. Use of juxtaposition. He is completely reintegrated by the end, though. So there's the question. I've isolated the question, starting with the extract. How does Dickens present Scrooge as an outsider? The how that there is ensuring that you identify techniques that Dickens uses. So I mentioned repetition or Gothic imagery, negative language, and so on. Okay, so this is the key element of the question. The examiner will be looking at how you apply your knowledge of the novella along with your analytical skills to this specific question. So don't just analyse the novel. The examiner's not checking for that. The examiner's checking for how well you analyse with a specific question in mind. This means that in every paragraph you will be referencing how Scrooge is presented and whether this representation portrays him as an outsider or not. So you focus on the extract. You should identify pieces of evidence that support the points you wish to make. So, how is Scrooge presented in this extract? Perhaps cold and wretched. Evidence the opening lines of the extract for evidence. An asyndetic list of negative synonyms. Asyndetic means a list without the connective and, just a long list. Kind of emphasises his negative character traits. The second part of the question, the second bullet point, and each of these bullet points are weighted equally. How Dickens presents Scrooge as an outsider in the novel as a whole. So jot down some initial ideas about how Scrooge is presented elsewhere. Look back to previous screen for ideas, for example. Has no friends, he's mean and horrible to everyone, he's without any Christmas cheer, he rejects requests for charity, instead of claiming that being poor is a crime and there are plenty of jails and workhouses for poor people if they don't like the streets. Compared to all decent characters in the novella, he stands out as different. However, he is completely reintegrated by the end. Now jot down some quotes you think you could use in relation to these. For example, are there no prisons? Easy one to remember. Are there no workhouses? Easy one to remember. Or, and became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew. Great one if you can remember it, because if you get a question on Scrooge, this encapsulates his redemption by the end. Repetition of good there, for example, just in case we didn't get the message. So how to structure your answer? Well, there's two approaches you could take. The first one, and that's the one I've chosen for this question, is not actually the one I'd advocate necessarily, but it does ensure you cover all the areas the examiner will be looking for. It's where you write 4 detailed paragraphs, 2 based on the extract and 2 from the wider play. Novella. Play for Shakespeare. I'm slipping up. The second approach is that you could write 3 very detailed paragraphs where you incorporate both the extract and the wider novella into each point. So as you're going through the extract and making a point about Scrooge being presented as an outsider, then link it to other parts in the story as you go. Okay, not forgetting to incorporate evidence and context where appropriate. So whichever approach you take, you need to structure each paragraph so that it contains specific elements the examiner would be looking for. To do this, you should use the following to help, or you could use the following to help. Now, I'm not going to read through all of this. Pause the screen. Make a note of it. But I use it, and your teachers will have given you various ways, like PEAZ, Pete, Peel. I use P to C. Point, evidence, technique, explanation, reader response, and context. Context is set aside there a little bit because it's only 20% of the overall mark, so it does not need to be incorporated into every point. Tentative analysis, perhaps could, simple connectives like these show, we don't know definitively what Dickens was intending, but we can offer inferences or suggestions. And there's a little general summary of how to analyse. Link directly to the question, quote to support what you've said, explain fully the meaning, use subject terminology, explain the effect on the reader and or the writer's intentions, and explore alternative meanings. Okay, I'm an examiner as well, and this kind of, I've looked at the top band level descriptors, and if you're incorporating these elements, not necessarily in that order, but incorporate all of these elements throughout each point, apart from the context, you're well on your way to top marks. Okay, so bearing in mind the question about how Scrooge is presented as an outsider, I've just written a little brief introduction plus my first point based on the extract, based on the notes I've taken. Okay, so Scrooge represents the selfish nature of the upper middle classes and their attitudes towards the lower classes. His miserly character is immediately presented as being at odds with all those around him in the lead up to Christmas Day. Brief introduction. In this extract, so it gets me focused now, Scrooge is introduced to us as an exceptional individual, one that blatantly stands out as being deeply unpleasant. Dickens wishes the reader to take an instant dislike to the tight-fisted Scrooge and describes him using an asyndetic list of synonyms, all with negative connotations. Squeezing, retching, grasping, clutching, covetous old sinner emphasises how his negative traits are endless. Dickens follows this up with two similes. The first to highlight his lack of generosity, describing him as hard and sharp as flint, and the second to really explore how he has become isolated, as solitary as an oyster. There is another possible interpretation of this description which could foreshadow his later redemption, as an oyster is hard on the outside but softer on the inside, hinting at how Scrooge becomes a transformed character by the end of the novella. Scrooge is constantly surrounded by his own low temperatures, revealing a complete lack of warmth. Just a point there, bear in mind the use of fire as a motif throughout the novel. He would be considered mean-spirited at the best of times, but in the run-up to Christmas, this frosty, cold and iced nature would put him at even greater odds with the wider society, especially at a time when Victorian London was overflowing with the poor and destitute. So in blue there, I've missed a couple out, but you get the idea. Obviously don't do this in your exam, but I've just highlighted where I've got the various elements from P to C contained within this paragraph. You'll see it doesn't have to be in that order, but they're all in there nonetheless. Okay, so that's your first point you could answer to this question. Here's a second point you could make. Now, I've not written it for you. You've got to do a little bit of the work yourselves. So the intrusive third-person judgmental narrator forces the reader to distance themselves from the character of Scrooge. Remember, Scrooge is an outsider, so the greater distance we have, the further on the outside he is. Repetition of no reinforces this negative portrayal, and the notion that Dickens wants the readership to intensely dislike Scrooge and all he stands for, the selfish, wealthy and powerful controlling classes. Nobody ever stopped him in the street highlights his isolation as a result of his unpleasantness. Evil and dark, use of Gothic imagery popular at the time, to prey on the insecurities of the Christian readership, to further emphasise the division between him and others, between the classes in society. So again, do pause, take some notes. Point 3, from the wider novella. Compare his character to those around him in the opening stave. Despite his renowned miserly ways, his nephew Fred visits him to invite him to spend Christmas Day with him and his friends. In the face of bar humbug from Scrooge, Fred retains his spirit of generosity, refusing to stoop to his uncle's level. Likewise, Bob Cratchit, his poor clerk, who he mistreats and grossly underpays, he still toasts his employer's health and thanks him for his job, however undervalued he is, and despite how much suffering he and his family must endure as a consequence. His missus isn't quite so generous. The Cratchits represent the poor and their mistreatment at the hands of the upper classes in Victorian society, an issue Dickens was acutely aware of, having witnessed his own father being thrown into prison because of debt. And do check out my other videos on social injustice and poverty and Dickens' role, or Dickens' reason, motivation, inspiration behind wanting to write a novel focusing on or raising this awareness. The final point you could make, his transformation, his redemption and ultimate reintegration back into society, having undertaken to amend his ways and become as good a friend, as good a master and as good a man as the good old city knew. Repetition of good, just to reinforce that he's good, in case we missed it. Sends the message that regardless of how much of an outsider one may be, if Scrooge can change, then so can you, reflecting Dickens' underlying message behind the story. For this point, explore how Scrooge underwent this transformation at the hands of the four spirits that visited him, and his response to them. Remember, Marley's ghost also preceded the three Christmas spirits. Okay, that's that. And finally, just a little message from me. Not sure how relevant it is. If you're watching this as a fully paid up member, then you've already made the right choice. But as a fully paid up member, if you have got a question you'd like me to focus on, then please just drop me a line. Just a general question, that's fine. I'll do my very best to reply as soon as possible. If you want something slightly more extensive, like an extract a particular extract, or if I haven't covered a text that you're studying at your school, like I'm looking at Merchant of Venice next and so on, then do drop me a line, and if there's a specific extract you'd like me to focus on, then do identify or highlight that extract for me, and maybe use the first line and the last line of the extract and the particular question you'd like me to focus on. Won't get it back to you the next day, but give me 2 or 3 days and I'll give it the Mr. H online treatment, such as it is. Okay, hope that was useful, and see you on the next video installment. Lovely. Bye now.